Hi everyone, this is National Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we continue our countdown of the 20 best games from the 2007 U.S. Chess League season. So today we're down to number 17. This is played between Jay Bonin and Mackenzi Molner. Bonin had white and Molner was black. Bonin played for the New York team and Molner for New Jersey. Now this is our second Bonin game, I believe, in the countdown. And again, it's a Bonin win. This game is, I would say, a much cleaner game, certainly from his point of view, than the first, and a bit less dramatic, but certainly a very interesting game. And as I said, overall, a better played game too. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's go ahead and start. Actually, before we start, I'll throw in my usual plug here for people to check out my blog, chessmind.powerblogs.com. chessmind.powerblogs.com. So I hope you'll enjoy that. Okay, so mini ad over. To the game we go. Alright, so Bonin plays d4, knight f6, knight f3, c5, d5, and now b5 is what was played by Molner. And if you ask me what the name of this opening is, I have to tell you I have no idea. And I tried to find out what this is called without any success. Now, if you have ChessBase, it'll tell you that this is a Schmid-Benoni, after the German Grandmaster Lothar Schmid, who's still alive, by the way, and has, here's a little trivia question, he has the world's largest collection of chess books and chess materials. At any rate, that appellation is inaccurate, so it goes under the same ECO code, it's A43, but the Schmid-Benoni is this, so g6, knight c3, so there's no c4 for white, bishop g7, e4, and now black castles or plays d6, let's say, and now white plays either bishop to b5 check or bishop to e2. So anyway, this is the Schmid-Benoni. What b5 is, I have no idea. It can still transpose into other things, but it's whatever it is at this point is unknown. And it continues in this unknown pattern. Alright, well at any rate, what do we do here? How do we make sense of this thing? What's the point of b5? Well, one thing that b5 does is it at least discourages white from playing c4. My mouse is a little finicky here at the moment, so I hope that won't cause any problems. Anyway, so c4, of course, can be met by just b takes c4, if black wants to play in that way, or he could just ignore it, and it turns into a regular Benko gambit. So anyway, c4 would transpose to that, but anyway, b5 at least is in part intended to discourage that. Also, black would like to play bishop to b7 and start laying siege to this pawn on d5, which is going to be a little bit difficult for white to defend. Alright, so what should white do? So, as we said, c4 would transpose into a kind of Benko gambit. Well, not just a kind, I mean it would be a Benko gambit with knight f3. Also, you might think a move like a4 makes sense, trying to kick this pawn away and exploiting the fact that black can't play a6 on account of the pin on the a file. However, after b4, black is actually pretty good. So white gets the c4 square, but by itself there's really not that much he can do with it. And also black will fianchetto this bishop. Well, he'll fianchetto both bishops, and they'll both end up being quite strong. So this isn't really the greatest solution in the world for white either. Also after a4, black could even play bishop to b7, and this looks pretty good too. So this is a more dynamic approach. Again, really just going after this d pawn. So white can take on b5, black can take on d5, and we'll have this kind of strategic race between white's attempt to really grab a lot of space on the queen side versus black's attempts to create a large pawn center. Okay, well, Bonin played neither move. He played bishop to g5. Alright, now here too, black has a number of options, and he has to decide also what he wants to do about this kind of positional threat to play bishop takes f6 and then e4. So there white would get this nice center. He would threaten the b5 pawn. He would secure his d5 pawn and mess up black's structure a little bit. On the other hand, black gets the bishop pair in a reasonable position too. So he can play, for example, just d6 and ignore this threat. So if white takes, which is the main move, black plays e takes f6, e4, probably a6, have to take a little timeout move here, And this position is just very, very interesting. And here black can either play b takes a4, which is kind of a funny looking move, but scored well, or the natural b4. And okay, this is just a very interesting and complicated position. So both sides have their trumps, and it's the better player will win kind of thing. But definitely it's not a simple position. Okay, back to bishop to g5. Another approach is to play queen to b6. So that way, on bishop takes f6, black can recapture with a piece, not a pawn, and keep his pawn structure intact. And also the queen will be very well placed there, hitting b2. So that's another idea. So bishop f6, queen f6, c3, d6, e4, a6, and black is in fine shape and has scored very well from this position. All right, neither of these moves were played by Molner. He played instead knight to e4. And now it's kind of like a Tory attack or a Trumpovsky, where this b5 and, well, white's knight f3 is a little bit unusual for a Trumpovsky, and b5 is a little bit unusual for black in either of those lines, but it at least has that kind of resemblance. But still, it's neither of them. Anyway, white could play either bishop to h4 here, or bishop to f4, and probably these are better than what Bonin played. So Bonin played queen to d3. Now, this is a logical move. I mean, white is trying to keep an initiative going. I mean, he's ahead in development. And after knight takes g5, knight takes g5, not only does he have two pieces out to none for black, he's also threatening the pawn on b5. But more to the point, he's got some neat little tactical possibilities involving this long diagonal and the pawn on f7. And as you can see, there's an intersection point there. So queen to f3 could prove really quite an annoying move for black to deal with. So here black has a couple of main moves. Get rid of this as my mouse continues to be rather temperamental. Okay, so one move here, which did not occur in the game, is e6. All right, so e6 hits the knight on g5, so it looks pretty logical, but it's also giving white a chance to take on e6 in some cases, which will clear this long diagonal. So we've got a couple of moves here. So the sane move is to play h4. So we just defend the knight, and now the threat is to play d takes e6 and queen f3. All right, so from here, black plays c4, hitting the queen, saving his pawn on b5 too. Don't forget about that. Queen f3, queen f6. So that way, he's stopping the threat to f7, proposing a trade of queens, and there's also the possibility of queen takes b2, which doesn't only hit the rook on a1, but it will threaten queen to c1 mate. So white should play knight to c3, and now in this very unclear and dynamic position, the two primary moves are bishop to b7, blocking the diagonal, and bishop to b4, counterattacking on c3. Okay, so as I said, this is the saner line of the two, so that's already pretty sharp. But even crazier than h4 is knight takes f7, and now this becomes really, really fun. Okay, so if black is bold, he'll take the knight, and now we have the following. So d takes e6 check, king e7, and now queen to f3. And here, this is just a nuts position. And this has actually happened in some tournament games. Okay, so white threatens, of course, the rook on the long diagonal, but he's also threatening to create some havoc with queen f7 check. The king has to come out to d6, and then knight to c3 is going to be the follow-up, threatening both to castle long and play knight takes b5, and all kinds of mayhem is going to ensue there. So here, just a couple of quick variations. All right, so one game saw knight to c6, queen f7 check, king d6, king to d6. Actually, knight c6 is my attempt to improve over what's happened before. All right, so knight to c3 now, knight to d4, protecting the b5 pawn and clearing some more space for the king to run to safety. Castles long b4, and this I would recommend as a great analysis position for anyone who's interested to work on their own. So I mean, white's got all kinds of interesting possibilities. He can play knight to e4 check, he could play e3, could play knight to b5 check, maybe e7. with the idea of queen to d5. So there's another idea. So there's all kinds of really fascinating things are possible here. And I heartily recommend this to those of you who like to analyze. Okay, so that's on knight c6. Now the move that's been played before is d5. And there's a game between two 2200 FIDE players. Gavin Roche was white, and Seraharia Ruiz was black. And I hope I didn't butcher his name too badly. That game continued with queen f7, king d6, knight c3, queen a5, e7. And I don't know if castles is best. White can't take the rook in the corner, because if he does this, he loses his queen. So castles is plausible, and this is just kind of a messy position. Black went on to win in 53 moves, but probably the position here is still pretty unclear. I'll show you the next few moves. Okay, and so we get to this position. White's got 3 pawns for the piece. Probably should be okay here, but you know, it's a position where you could still lose, certainly. All right, but instead of queen to f7, I think knight to c3 is a significant improvement. And now, bishop takes e6. I mean, normally you would think that this should just be completely fine for black. But after castle's long, the d5 pawn is in real trouble. And of course, if he pushes it, then he loses the rook in the corner yet once again, and he can't recapture the knight because the pin on the d file to the queen. So black's best is probably something like king to e8, takes, knight to d7. But even after bishop to d3, I think white's clearly better. He only has 2 pawns for the piece, but you know, black's king is just in a world of trouble here. There's no way he's going to castle. There are all kinds of light square weaknesses. White's threatening things like bishop to f5, just piling up on this poor miserable knight. The rook can come to d1, and this just isn't an easy position at all for black to play. I mean, he's just really tied down. So this is definitely a very good way for white to proceed, which means that, again, after white plays queen f3, black should really play knight to c6. Anyway, lots of fun here. And I would say this is a good reason for black to play moves other than e6 in this position. And that's, in fact, what happened. So Molner played g6, not allowing white all these shots on the long diagonal. All right, well, here there are a couple of moves. Actually, 3 moves have been played, at least. Perhaps, well, I don't know, perhaps the best move, though I'm not 100% sure, is h4. And this was played in a game between Hebden, who's a British Grandmaster, and Gormley, who actually now is a British Grandmaster too, but maybe at the time was an IM. Anyway, I'll just give the next few moves of this game. So h4, bishop g7, c3. Black was threatening to take the pawn on b2. And now black has had enough of this advanced knight. So h6, knight f3, c4, saving the b pawn. And here we have a really kind of distinct position. And I would just say it's about equal. So black's bishops are very good, but white has a nice pawn center, though black will probably kick away at it with e6 at some point. And as I said, it's just a very complicated position. White's knight on d4 is very nice, and who knows? So this may be, at least, you know, it's a rare line, but maybe this is the most important theoretical position in the line, at least that I'm aware of so far. So everything else, it seems to me that it resolves fairly straightforwardly as an advantage for either white or black. So this is at least pretty complicated. Okay, so this, as I said, is with 7h4. Now, the move that was played in the highest rated game in this opening saw the move e4. And this was played by Vitaly Golod, who's a near 2600 Grandmaster, against Topalov in Bogoyno in 1999. And again, I hope I didn't butcher that place name. So e4 looks very, very logical, but it's probably a mistake, and that's how Golod evaluated the position, and I think he's right about this. So bishop to g7 was Topalov's rejoinder, c3, again protecting the b pawn, castles, bishop e2, e6. Now this is a nice idea that we'll see later on in the analysis. That black doesn't have to spend time on a move like d6 first. Well, first of all, he's simply threatening to take the knight, which is the immediate threat. But we'll see this as a general point, that d6 is a move that black can dispense with. So knight f3, Topalov exchanged. Now queen to b6 with the point we saw in an earlier variation, that queen takes a8 is met by bishop to b7, winning the queen for insufficient material compensation. So white played knight b to d2, and Topalov played bishop to b7. And here black is clearly better. He's got the bishop pair, he's got more space on the queen side. His d-pawn is the only theoretical weakness he's got, since it's backward, but it's first of all, it's hard to attack, and secondly, it's pretty easy to dissolve it with d5 if black so desires. So the game continued. Just get a couple more moves. Queen to b3, c4, d6, and black had absolutely no trouble here and went on to win in 36 moves. Pretty straightforwardly too. So e4, heading back here, is no real solution. So h4 is probably best. e4 is a natural-looking move, but it probably isn't very good. And so then there's a move played by Bonin, and in fact he's played this a couple of times and is the only person to play this move. Queen takes b5. But it's completely natural. I mean, why not play this? Take the pawn. You're threatening the c5 pawn as well. You're ahead in development, so how bad can this be? And you're also stopping bishop to b7 too, at least for the moment. Well, it's I don't think it's a bad move, but I don't think it's as good as h4. All right. Anyway, black played bishop to g7, and that certainly indirectly protects the pawn in c5 because bishop takes b2 is completely unfavorable for white. Now, Bonin has played this at least a couple of times, twice at least in the databases, once in this game and one previous time against Brian Smith. In the game with Brian Smith, which was played in Stillwater, Oklahoma in 2007, before this game, he played the move knight to c3. And this is probably okay, but it's very, very risky. Okay, black played knight to a6, which protects the c5 pawn and threatens rook to b8. Now, in the earlier game, well, in the game with Smith, Bonin played e3, and this is just a losing move already. Rook to b8, queen a4, rook takes b2, and his position is already catastrophically bad. And the problem is that he just has no real answer to the tactical problems he's got on this diagonal. So this knight on c3 is hanging, and it's very tough for white to defend it. If he plays knight g to e4, black can probably just play f5. And, so much for that great defensive idea. In the game he played queen to a3. Smith just took on c2, saves his rook, and builds up again some more on the knight on c3. Knight g to e4. Knight to b4, so another nasty little shot, threatening rook takes c3 and knight to c2 check, winning the queen. Also threatening perhaps just to play knight takes d5 and then bishop takes rook. So Bonin played rook to c1 and now f5, and that was the end of a piece. And Bonin tried to resist for a few more moves, but lost in 26. It's just an utter rout. So instead of knight to c3, white could have improved. He didn't have to play e3. He could have castled. And he doesn't lose here, but after rook to b8, let's say queen to b6, and now d6, black has really good compensation for the pawn. I mean, he's got two bishops. The bishop on g7 is just bearing down on the long diagonal, and, it's got the open b file. Then I can come to b4 in some cases, or maybe plays c4. Anyway, it's very easy to see how black can make constructive moves. A lot more difficult to see how white does anything more than just kind of fight black off a move at a time here. So Bonin made a definite improvement for the game with Molner that we're going to look at here now. So instead of knight to c3, he played knight to d2. And this is a novelty. All right, well, again, black played knight to a6, protecting the c5 pawn and preparing rook to b8. And now this time, Bonin has c3. So this is a much more elegant way of defending the pawn on b2 and the long diagonal in general. All right, so black gets his pawn back, rook to b8, and then rook takes b2. But now we see another point of knight to d2 instead of knight c3, namely the move knight to c4. So as knight finds its way to a good position, the long diagonal has been neutralized, and after rook to b8, e4, it looks like white's actually in pretty good shape here. Now, I think, though, that even though Bonin's 8th move, knight to d2, was a genuine improvement, it still seems to me that black actually is at least equal here. So I think that really the solution for white is perhaps not to go into this whole variation with queen to d3. Okay, well, here black played d6, which is a very natural move, and it's certainly not a bad move. But as I mentioned in the when we were looking at the Golod-Topalov game, I think black can just forsake that, or forego it, I should say, and simply castle. So first of all, the idea is just to follow up with e6, and also we can note that if white tries to punish black for not playing d6 with a move like e5, he'll discover that he was simply overextended. So black plays d6, and let's say white plays f4. I mean, if he takes on d6, then he's just got nothing. But now black plays knight to c7, and bishop to b7, and white's going to have a dickens of a time trying to keep this d5 pawn secure. I mean, this guy is just going to leave the board. I mean, he could play something like knight to e3, but then he's just losing this pawn. So this position is probably already lost for white. So very bad position. So you shouldn't play e5, but even without that, his position isn't so great either. Anyway, the point is about not playing d6 is that black can simply play e6 anyway. And if white ever plays d6, well, that's no problem at all, because after bishop to b7, all white has done is managed to extend black's diagonal further. Okay, but anyway, d6, there's nothing wrong with this move. White played bishop to e2, both sides castle, and let's talk about this position a little bit here. So white's got the typical Benoni space advantage here, and would like to maybe play f4 and e5 at some point, if he can do it without, well, losing the d-pawn for starters, and just giving up too many squares. So I mean, when the pawn goes to e5, then black can bring his bishop to f5, as an example. But that's the kind of thing that's often on the cards for white in Benoni structures. Okay, well, what about for black? So white's got this extra space, and what does black have? Well, what black has, first of all, he's got the bishop pair, has the b file for the moment anyway, but also all of his pieces actually are going to be well placed. So the bishop on g7 is great, the rook on b8 is fine, and after knight to c7, black is able to in this way take care of two more pieces. So the bishop can come to a6, and the knight can come to b5, where it puts some pressure on the c3 pawn. So that's a couple of ideas. Also, maybe instead of playing knight to b5, another idea for black is to play e6 at some point and really try to undermine white's pawn center here. So if black can do that and get the central majority, let's say white takes on e6, black takes with the f pawn, and then if black can play d5, you can see that these guys can really start to roll. And in conjunction with the bishop pair, this can give black a very nice game. So I'm inclined to think that this is actually a very good position for black already. All right, well here white's got a couple of options. So there's the move in the game, which is rook a to b1, but knight to a5 is also interesting, and this is a move that sometimes shows up in Benoni's. All right, the idea naturally is to just plant this knight on c6 and to cause black some further anguish in his development. Also, by playing knight to a5, at some point it clears the path for this pawn to come to c4. Of course, not right away, because the bishop on g7 would hit the rook on a1. But by playing c4, then it shores up this pawn on d5, and then white can play for f4 and e5 if he wants to, without having to worry about losing his whole center. Okay, well here black has two choices. There's bishop to d7, which is simple and good. The knight really has nothing to do on a5 if it's not going to be able to safely land on c6. So this would be perfectly good. But another interesting move is knight takes d5. And okay, so the obvious point is that if white takes on d5 with something, black gets the knight on a5 and wins a pawn. So knight c6 is forced, and then we have this interesting little sequence. Knight f4, queen e3, takes, takes and takes, rook a to b1 and queen c7. And here white's up the exchange for a pawn, but black's got the bishop pair against just the white knight. And he's got one big pawn island here, so this certainly helps his chances that all of these guys are connected and mutually supporting. And, well, the bishop on g7 is especially good. So white maybe has a minuscule edge here after maybe c4, but I think black is doing okay too. And this would be at least a very interesting way to play. And I'm not sure that black has 100% compensation, but it's certainly playable and interesting. Anyway, as I said, bishop to d7 though is simple and good. So knight a5 probably isn't white's best. And Bonin played rook a to b1. And here I think, although Molner's played very well up to this point, I think here he starts to go a bit wrong. And I want to make a general point about exchanging. And I've noticed in games by students and games I've played that often lower-rated players, when they're faced with an exchange, and this exchange seems to be inevitable, and I'm in this case referring to the opposition of these rooks on the b file, they'll simply initiate the exchange just to get it over with, thinking something like, well, the trade has to happen anyway, so I might as well just get it out of the way and then move on to the next thing. But you should be a little careful and a little hesitant, because even if the exchange is inevitable, sometimes it's possible to make this exchange occur under favorable circumstances. And so it is here. Now, I think Molner probably rejected something like bishop to a6 because he thought, I would have guessed, something like, well, okay, if I do that, Bonin would just make the exchange and play rook to b1, and we're in the same situation anyway, so nothing's really changed, and so I might as well just get it out of the way. But there are a couple of problems with this line of thinking. So one is that in this position, black actually can gain an advantage. So he has the move bishop takes c4. So he has this little Zwischenzug here. Of course, white can't take on c4 because then he just loses the rook in the game with queen takes b1. So rook takes b8, bishop d3, rook f8, king f8, bishop takes d3. And now after h6, knight f3, bishop c3, black has won a pawn. And this would have been, I'm sure if Molner had been given the chance, had been offered this position, if someone said, hey, would you accept this position? And if the offer had been made here after rook a to b1, I think he would have accepted it. I mean, he's simply up a pawn. And despite the opposite color bishops, I think black has very good winning chances here. I mean, opposite color bishops are certainly have a strong drawish tendency, especially when there's no other pieces on the board. But here, those drawish tendencies really don't come into play. The extra pair of knights makes a big difference, and the pawn structure is such that black has many things that he can do before any kind of light square blockade is going to arise for white. So anyway, the point is that this would have been really good for black, and would have shown that white can't maintain or can't just win the b file for himself. All right, so after queen takes b8, we just saw rook to b1, and that doesn't really work for white. The better move is queen to c2, but even here, after either queen to a8, with the idea of playing rook to b8, if white plays rook to b1, and also just to try to undermine white's center on the long diagonal with moves like e6 and or f5, black is fine here, and after queen to d8, maybe he's even better. The threat is to play e6, discovering an attack on the knight, and again, taking aim at white's center here. So, for example, f4, e6, d, e, f, e, rook f3, and now d5. So this is something that we mentioned earlier. Black's pawns are starting to roll. His bishops are kind of strafing the board here. I mean, they're both just excellent. And the f-file is another asset for black, too. White is in serious trouble here. Okay, so going back to the position after bishop to a6, we just saw that rook takes b8 really isn't very successful, but rook to b3 isn't that great either. So now black can make the exchange and again play e6 with the double attack on the knight and on white's center. So knight f3, ed, rook e8, and again black is just clearly better. White has to worry about the c3 pawn, he has to worry about the d5 pawn. This rook is beautifully active here. Black may follow up with moves like queen to a8, or maybe queen to b8, or queen to f6. And you can see, I mean, white's position is a target-rich environment. Well, one other idea, too, maybe knight to b5 to gang up on the c3 pawn. So you can see, I mean, black's bishop pair and just his development in general is really working outstandingly. So I think bishop to a6 here would have given black an advantage. So unfortunately, Molner played rook takes b1, and e6. So we saw this idea already. It's very logical. He's taking aim at the center and hitting the knight. But the problem is that white's rook is really going to take advantage of this b file in a big way. Okay, so queen and g3 is what happened. All right, so queen and g3 protects the knight on g5, and it also starts to take aim at this pawn on d6 too. Now the position is still equal, but only if Molner plays correctly. So if he plays the move bishop to a6, so again, oops, okay, again my mouse is misbehaving. Bishop to a6. Here, black is still okay. So by doing this, he's first of all keeping white's rook off of the b8 square. He's also protecting his d pawn because of the pin on the bishop on e2. And I think the position is roughly equal here. And don't forget, black also has his own threats to the pawn on d5. After d takes e6, and we have this exchange here, and now queen to e3, protecting the bishop on e2. I think the position is roughly equal. One possible continuation is this: queen to d7, e5, takes, and d5. And both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, and both bishops are going to function pretty well, but not enough to be decisively better one way or another. All right, so anyway, this would have been, I think, a pretty logical way for the game to have continued. Molner would have missed a chance, but still would be in good shape here. Unfortunately, he didn't play bishop to a6, but played h6. And, okay, I mean, he wants to kick this knight from its outpost, but there's a serious tactical problem. And now we'll see how much black would have liked to have played bishop to a6 earlier. So here, Bonin gets to shine. And all of a sudden, from this very interesting, strategically intricate and dynamic game, all of a sudden it just becomes pure tactics, and all the play is on white's side. All right, so figure out what it is that white should do. I've probably already hinted too much, but see if you can work it out. I mean, so not just finding the first move, but trying to calculate a few moves ahead. So stop the lecture if you want, and come back when you think you've got it worked out. Okay, so here's what happened. Knight takes f7. Now, this really just wrecks black's position. I mean, it's amazing that he went from such a stable, fundamentally sound game to really just being lost in a single move, or almost lost. It's not quite decisive, but it's very hard to defend, and he wasn't able to do it. Okay, so here, king takes f7 doesn't really make much sense because knight takes d6 is still going to happen, and it'll come in a way that gives black fewer choices rather than more. So rook takes f7 is the better move. And now knight takes d6. And if we assess this, I mean, we'll see that white has just all kinds of things going for him. So he's got two pawns for the piece, so it's already not that big of a sacrifice. He's hitting the rook. He's hitting the g-pawn. He's threatening rook to b8. There's that b file. And we'll see he's got some other ideas too. For example, knight takes c8, followed by d6 and e5. So that too is another idea that black has to really be afraid of. I mean, we'll see some variations where that's just leads to a miserable position for black. All right, so anyway, the threat is rook to b8, and black has to be able to do something about it. And he really has two choices. So he can either play rook to f8, which is what happens in the game, so that way he can meet rook to b8 with queen to d7, and that's what happens. But the other way for him to play is to play rook to d7, so that way rook to b8 is met, of course, by rook takes d6. Now, on this, we'll see that idea that I mentioned with the pawn wedge. And after e5, I mean, this is pretty horrible for black. Let's look at all the threats that there are. So there's bishop to b5, and if the rook moves, then d7. There's simply queen takes g6, and that might be followed up with moves like bishop to d3 or bishop to g4, going for a kill shot on e6. What else? Well, bishop to c4 and queen to g4, kind of similar. bishop to d3 and bishop takes g6. I mean, it's just a nightmare. So, for example, if king to h7, bishop d3 is game over. If king to f7, then bishop to b5. Say rook to d8, queen f3, takes. And now another nice little puzzle here. What's the best way for white to finish the game at this point? So again, you might want to stop it for a moment and see if you can figure out what white ought to do. Okay, the answer is d7. So a very nice little shot. If you play rook to b7 straight away, then rook to f8 allows black to defend. But d7 takes care of that. Black has to take, and now rook to b7 is winning decisive material. Because if the queen goes someplace safe, then queen to f7 check, and queen takes g7 is mate. So black has to give up the queen one way or another. I guess you could play rook to f8, but still rook takes d7, rook f3, gf3, and black has no real compensation for the exchange. Okay, so after e5, maybe black's best is bishop takes e5, but this is pretty miserable too, and then he doesn't even have any material to console him. So you can see that black is just creaking everywhere. So in a position like this, white's up a pawn, he's got threats on the diagonal, he's got threats on the 7th rank, he's got a better structure, as if, he didn't have enough trumps, and he's got this a-pawn that is going to start running down the board too. So this is just dead lost for black. Okay, so the point of all of that was just to show that rook to d7 isn't going to cut it on account of this idea. So instead of rook to d7, as I mentioned already, Molner played rook to f8 with the idea of meeting rook to b8 with queen to d7. Okay, now here white could play d takes e6. That's not a bad move, but he's still not winning just yet. So this is a neat little idea for white. He's winning a piece here because black can't play rook takes c8. This would be a big blunder. Well, I'll just show you. Because if queen takes c7, and of course black can't take with the rook because he's in check, so knight takes, rook takes wins. So after knight takes c8, he's got to just accept the loss of the piece. But after king to h7, white's only clearly better here because even though he's 2 pawns up, he's got this this really annoying pin, and it's not so easy to break it either. So white's, I don't know, probably in the long run white's winning, but it's a little bit awkward. So Bonin, I'm sure, saw a variation like that and decided to play knight takes c8 instead. And this is a good move. Okay, now here black has really just one move to stay alive, I think. So he should play e takes d5. Again, trying to exploit this pin. Now, white's best maybe h3 after d takes e4. So again, notice black can't play rook takes c8 because of bishop to g4. Alright, so that's just winning with this deadly skewer. But after d takes e4, it's really not so bad. So rook to b7, queen takes c8, rook c7, queen d8. White's much better, but material is even, and you have opposite color bishops. Now, actually, that's going to favor white more than it's going to favor black at the moment, but still, with the open f file and possibility of maybe a move like queen f6, I mean, black is at least reasonably solid here, reasonably stable. So expect white to win in the long run, but accidents could still happen in a position like this. Okay, but instead of e takes d5, Molner played the obvious and, not horrible rook takes c8. Now here, white missed a little bit of an opportunity. So the best would have been to use that pawn wedge that we've already seen with rook takes, d6, and then e5. And here I think white is just completely winning. So again, threats to take here. It's also threats like bishop to d3 or bishop to c4. And the light square devastation is ultimately going to decide. And the main thing is really that black is playing without both of his minor pieces. I mean, this knight on e8 is completely dominated at the moment. The bishop on g7 is locked in too. And you can see maybe a move like f4 would further solidify the cage. There's really no way for black to get out of it. I mean, you can even notice the knight can't escape because if, let's say, bishop to f8 and knight to g7, white could prepare g4 by then, if it's even really anything to worry about. So this position after e5 is just winning for white. And this would have been probably the best way to play the position. All right, but Bonin's move was natural and not a bad move, just not the best move. So he played rook to b7, and this threatens all kinds of mayhem too. So he's threatening moves like bishop to c4, bishop to g4, that's especially dangerous, queen takes g6, and of course also d6, taking advantage of the pin here. But in spite of all of these many threats, black still has a defense here. Queen to a4. So you give up the knight, but now after queen takes e4, he's actually coordinated pretty well. So he's threatening the bishop, and the bishop has to be a little careful because of back rank issues too. So bishop to f1 is probably the simplest way to play. Queen b8, and we get to this position. And white is clearly better. I mean, he's up a pawn, and it's a good pawn too. I mean, this pawn, you know, if black doesn't find something very active and dangerous for white, something to really distract white from this plan of simply pushing it, then it's going to be a very easy win for Bonin. But in this position, I think black can still resist. So let's say king to g8 to unpin his bishop. And now if a4, bishop takes c3. So let's say c4. Well, now queen to d2 can prove quite annoying. Queen takes c5, bishop d4, and all of a sudden the pressure against this pawn on f2 makes it quite an interesting game. So white's best is probably something like this, bring his queen back to f3. But now queen takes a2, and a white win is far from guaranteed here. Now maybe white could have found something better somewhere along those lines, but you know, this is the kind of thing that black can do, and this shows the power of opposite color bishops. Not as a drawing weapon, though here maybe in a kind of ironic way it's a drawing weapon, but as an attacking force. I mean, the problem for white is that his bishop on f1 really is contributing nothing to stabilizing his position. So it protects the c4 pawn, but it doesn't do anything to help to diminish black's counterplay on the dark squares. So anyway, queen to a4 I think would have been quite interesting. So this ending is far from clear. In the game, Molner played e takes d5, and this just loses right away. Bishop g4, and now the game is simply over. Queen a4, h3 takes care of the back rank problems. Of course not bishop takes c8, which deserves, well, all you can give it is 2 question marks, but it deserves many more than that. Queen d1 mate. Okay, so simply h3, and the point is that the rook can move, but if the rook moves, if this rook on c8 moves, then rook takes c7 anyway, and white just has a devastating attack. Or actually, not even rook c7, but queen c7. Much more intelligent with a quick mate coming. All right, so here black tried a last gasp trick here. Queen takes e4, bishop c8, d4, takes and takes. All right, so black has got, I mean, he's only down the exchange, and he's hoping that this d4 pawn will cause some trouble. You know, just keeps going down the board if it's allowed. Also, it looks as if white can't take on c7, because queen takes c7. Then there's queen to e1 check, king h2, bishop to e5. So that would be a big oops for white. And rook takes c7 doesn't look any good either, because of, again, queen to e1 check, king h2, and bishop to e5. Okay, so what should white play in this position? So see if you can figure it out. Again, this is the last little quiz we'll do here for the game. So take a moment, stop the recording, try to work it out. Okay, so I'm going to assume you've all figured out what white can do here and whether or not he can capture the knight on c7. And the answer is that he can indeed do so. So rook takes c7, queen check, king h2, bishop to e5, and now the key move, and it's the last move of the game, bishop to e6. And here Molner resigned. So the point is that wherever the king goes, white is going to have a safe check with the rook, and then after f4, black is simply down a rook with no compensation whatsoever. So after bishop to e6, Molner resigned, and Bonin managed to win. So a nice combination by Bonin, very alert, and that's I think another good little lesson for us, because often, a game will take a certain course where all of these strategic factors are preeminent, and so we're thinking about all these pawn breaks or various development schemes, and when a tactical opportunity comes available,